Silk routes link the world. The Silk routes are a good example of vibrant pre-modern trade and cultural links between distant parts of the world. The name Silk routes points to the importance of westbound Chinese silk cargoes along this route. Historians have identified several silk routes over land and by sea, knitting together vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and northern Africa. They are known to have existed since before the Christian era and thrived almost till the 15th century. But Chinese pottery also traveled the same route, as did textiles and spices from India and Southeast Asia. In return, precious metals, gold and silver flowed from Europe to Asia. Trade and cultural exchange always went hand in hand. Early Christian missionaries almost certainly traveled this route to Asia, as did early Muslim preachers a few centuries later. Much before all this, Buddhism emerged from eastern India and spread in several directions through intersecting points on the Silk routes. Food travels, spaghetti and potato. Food offers many examples of long-distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduced new crops to the lands they traveled. Even ready foodstuff in distant parts of the world might share common origins. Take spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Or perhaps Arab traders took pasta to 5th century Sicily, an island now in Italy. Similar foods were also known in India and Japan. So, the truth about their origins may never be known. Yet, such guesswork suggests the possibilities of long-distance cultural contact even in the pre-modern world. Many of our common foods, such as potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chillies, sweet potatoes, and so on, were not known to our ancestors until about 5 centuries ago. These foods were only introduced in Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered the vast continent that would later be known as the Americas. Here we will use America to describe North America, South America, and the Caribbean. In fact, many of our common foods came from America's original inhabitants, the American Indians. Sometimes the new crops could make the difference between life and death. Europe's poor began to eat better and live longer with the introduction of the humble potato. Ireland's poorest peasants became so dependent on potatoes that when disease destroyed the potato crop, in the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands died of starvation. Conquest, disease, and trade. The pre-modern work shrank greatly in the 16th century after European sailors found a sea route to Asia and also successfully crossed the Western Ocean to America. For centuries before, the Indian Ocean had known a bustling trade with goods, people, knowledge, customs, etc., crisscrossing its waters. The Indian subcontinent was central to these flows and a crucial point in their networks. The entry of the Europeans helped expand or redirect some of these flows towards Europe. Before its discovery, America had been cut off from regular contact with the rest of the world for millions of years. But from the 16th century, its vast lands and abundant crops and minerals began to transform trade and lives everywhere. Precious metals, particularly silver from mines located in present-day Peru and Mexico, also enhanced Europe's wealth and financed its trade with Asia. Legend spread in 17th century Europe about South America's fabled wealth. Many expeditions set off in search of El Dorado, the fabled city of gold. The Portuguese and Spanish conquest and colonization of America was decisively underway by the mid-16th century. European conquest was not just a result of a superior firepower. In fact, the most powerful weapon of the Spanish conquerors was not a conventional military weapon at all. It was the germs, such as those of smallpox, that they carried on their person. Because of their long isolation, America's original inhabitants had no immunity against these diseases that came from Europe. Smallpox in particular proved a deadly killer. Once introduced, it spread deep into the continent, ahead even of any Europeans reaching there. It killed and decimated whole communities, paving the way for conquest. Guns could be bought or captured and turned against the invaders, but not diseases such as smallpox, to which the conquerors were mostly immune. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Cities were crowded and deadly diseases were widespread. Religious conflicts were common and religious dissenters were persecuted. Thousands, therefore, fled Europe for America. Here, by the 18th century, plantations worked by slaves captured in Africa were growing cotton and sugar for European markets. Until well into the 18th century, China and India were among the world's richest countries. They were also preeminent in Asian trade. However, from the 15th century, China is said to have restricted overseas contacts and retreated into isolation. China's reduced role and the rising importance of the Americas gradually moved the center of the world trade westwards. Europe now emerged as the center of world trade. The 19th century, 1815 to 1914. The world changed profoundly in the 19th century. Economic, political, social, cultural, and technological factors interacted in complex ways to transform societies and reshape external relations. Economists identify three types of movements or flows within international economic exchanges. The first is the flow of trade, which in the 19th century referred largely to trade in goods, for example, cloth or wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of people in search of employment. The third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investments over long distances. All three flows were closely interwoven and affected people's lives more deeply now than ever before. The interconnections could sometimes be broken. For example, labor migration was often more restricted than goods or capital flows. Yet, it helps us understand the 19th century world economy better if we look at the three flows together. A world economy takes shape. A good place to start is the changing pattern of food production and consumption in industrial Europe. Traditionally, countries like to be self-sufficient in food. But in 19th century Britain, self-sufficiency in food meant lower living standards and social conflict. Why was this so? Population growth from the late 18th century had increased the demand for food grains in Britain, which as a result pushed up food grain prices. Under pressure from landed groups, the government also restricted the import of corn. The laws allowing the government to do this were commonly known as the Corn Laws. Unhappy with high food prices, industrialists and urban dwellers forced the abolition of the Corn Laws. After the Corn Laws were scrapped, food could be imported into Britain more cheaply than it could be produced within the country. British agriculture was unable to compete with imports. Vast areas of land were now left uncultivated, and thousands of men and women were thrown out of work. They flocked to the cities or migrated overseas. As food prices fell, consumption in Britain rose. From the mid-19th century, faster industrial growth in Britain also led to higher incomes and therefore more food imports. Around the world, in Eastern Europe, Russia, America, and Australia, lands were cleared and food production expanded to meet the British demand. It was not enough merely to clear lands for agriculture. Railways were needed to link the agricultural regions to the ports. New harbors had to be built and old ones expanded to ship the new cargoes. People had to settle on the lands to bring them under cultivation. This meant building homes and settlements. All these activities in turn required capital and labor. Capital flowed from financial centers such as London. The demand for labor in places where labor was in short supply, as in America and Australia, led to more migration. Nearly 50 million people emigrated from Europe to America and Australia in the 19th century. All over the world, some 150 million are estimated to have left their homes, crossed oceans and vast distances over land in search of a better future. Thus, by 1890, a global agricultural economy had taken shape, accompanied by complex changes in labor movement patterns, capital flows, ecologies. Food no longer came from a nearby village or town, but from thousands of miles away. It was not grown by a peasant tilling his own land, but by an agricultural worker, perhaps recently arrived, who was now working on a large farm that only a generation ago had most likely been a forest. It was transported by railway, built for that very purpose, and by ships which were increasingly manned in these decades by low-paid workers from Southern Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Some of this dramatic change, though on a smaller scale, occurred closer home in West Punjab. Here the British Indian government built a network of irrigation canals to transform semi-desert wastes into fertile agricultural lands that could grow wheat and cotton for export. The canal colonies, as the areas irrigated by the new canals were called, were settled by peasants from other parts of Punjab. Of course, food is merely an example. A similar story can be told for cotton, the cultivation of which expanded worldwide to feed British textile mills.